Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the first part of this three-part presentation series on science news literacy as a tool against misinformation. In the second part of this presentation, we will examine how science literacy can and should be applied when you read about science in the news and why science literacy is such a valuable tool. We will begin by talking about science in the news. Today, more than ever before, science knowledge, and thus science literacy, is a crucial aspect of everyday life. Technologies and much of the most important information that we come across, from discussions of global warming to pandemics to space travel, require a basic understanding of scientific methods, theories, and facts for us to follow. Some of the most important decisions we make in life about whether or not to get a vaccine, whether to support public funding for science or medical research, the effects of global warming and the steps to slow or reverse it, even more mundane everyday decisions about health and behavior, require a basic understanding of science. Technological advancements and discoveries, and advancements in computer science, physics, biology, and medicine are all occurring at an ever more rapid pace and with an ever greater impact on our daily lives. Every aspect of our daily lives, from home life to work to political decisions, require basic science and technology literacy and skills in order for us to function. As mentioned, today, more than in previous generations, people have greater distrust in the social institutions that provide official news reports. This distrust is exacerbated by the proliferation of alternative perspectives and fake news. This distrust and the proliferation of information that contradicts official validated news shakes the foundation of science, truth, and society as a whole. When people don't trust vital social institutions and their status as official sources of validated, truthful information, they are less likely to support these institutions and less likely to participate in them. Lower support and participation in social institutions weakens these institutions' power and role in people's lives and ultimately can destabilize society. As mentioned, the most pressing issues of today require science to address. Because these issues and their solutions are scientific in nature, understanding them requires basic science literacy. That is, sufficient knowledge of scientific methods, theories, and facts to understand the source of the issue, how significant it is, and the options for resolving it. Science literacy is also necessary to determine whether the information is valid and whether the interpretations of the events and facts are accurate. The foundation of scientific methods and information is external validation. Science must be able to withstand counter-arguments or to change when it is shown that the information cannot be validated with actual experience. In short, in order to be validated, scientific methods and findings must be critically questioned and verified. So many of the most important issues and aspects of life today involve science. Thus, a large portion of news stories involve science, either directly or indirectly. News is a crucial vehicle to spread public awareness of science information. This public awareness allows the public to critically engage with and challenge scientific information. However, in order to critically engage with, test, and ultimately disregard or incorporate scientific information, the public needs to have basic science literacy. Science literacy is also the key means by which people can detect and challenge fake news. While there is more distrust in public institutions like science and medicine today than in previous eras, still the majority of the public in the United States does support scientific and medical research. This public support is critical for the functioning of science as a social institution. Again, research advancements and theories depend upon external validation. This validation requires awareness, engagement, and reaction not only from other experts, but from the broad public. However, This process of awareness, critical engagement, and reaction can seem overwhelming because there is so much information and contradictory perspectives for the public to sift through in order to analyze the data and validate science information and news stories. Next, let's discuss how biases and agendas affect news. News stories always have an agenda. The agenda can be hidden or apparent. In the case of fake news, this agenda is always unstated, though in the case of satire, it may be apparent by the nature or tone of the reporting. One key aspect of determining the legitimacy of news stories or news sources is whether or not you are able to learn enough about the source to determine what agenda or biases it may have. In other words, legitimate sources are transparent. One key way to learn about the potential agendas or biases of a story, reporter, or news source is to research them on the internet. Visiting their personal or professional websites can provide a lot of insight. Social media accounts can also be an illuminating source of information. Essentially, you want to learn about the mission, interests, and other works in order to figure out the opinions and affiliations that could influence their reporting. There is always a particular perspective that is being taken, and choices are always made as to what information to include and what to exclude, and which questions to focus on. In other words, there is always some bias involved in news reporting. Sometimes the agenda or bias is towards gaining viewers or readership. Sometimes it is purely about increasing public awareness of a topic. The existence of some degree of bias does not mean that all news is fake or invalid. As with fake news, it is a matter of gradient and transparency. Legitimate news or other information sources will of course reflect some biases. However, these biases should be minimalized by relying upon validated information and presenting various sides to a story. Standpoints refer to the perspective that a story takes. These standpoints are a source of bias in reporting. Standpoints are a natural aspect of any perspective. They arise because the way that we view information or events is based on our previous experience and the structure of our lives and realities. For example, the impact and significance of a political uprising would be seen as different in the context of a country that has seen major uprisings and revolutions before, compared to a country that has not. One major source of differing perspectives, and thus differing standpoints, comes from the global position of the country in which someone lives. That is, where this country lies in the global economy, its political structure, its relationship to other countries, how much global cultural influence and political governmental power it holds, etc. As such, there are significant differences in standpoints between the quote-unquote developed and quote-unquote developing world. That is, between the global north and the global south. Between Western countries and non-Western countries, in other words. Standpoints are a source of bias. In order to understand this bias and the effect that it has on what information is being presented and what is being left out, and how it is presented and interpreted, it is necessary to understand the interests, history, societal structure, and global position that may be influencing the perspective of the reporter or reporting agency. In other words, it is necessary to understand the context in which the story is being presented. As mentioned, all news or information sources have some agenda, some standpoint, and thus some bias. The difference between legitimate and fake news sources is not about a lack of bias necessarily, but rather about the degree of bias, how much bias there is, and more importantly, the transparency of this potential bias. Legitimate news sources should provide enough background information about the story, the reporter, and/or the reporting agency to determine what these biases may be. If you are not able to find information about the credentials, interests, affiliations, funding, or previous work of reporters or reporting agencies, this is a red flag that the news source is likely not legitimate. Further, if you cannot validate the source of the information presented, that is, where did they get their information, you should be suspicious. Essentially, assume it's invalid unless it can be validated. The most insidious fake news, like propaganda, conspiracy theories, and hoaxes, work hard to appear legitimate and to hide their background or mission. However, this apparent legitimacy is usually only on the surface. A little bit of digging into the background usually leads to uncovering suspicious information or a suspicious lack of information. Finally, we will discuss how science literacy applies to reading about science in the news. To repeat, science as an institution is defined by the fact that it produces validated information. Thus, information, particularly science information, is not valid until it can be validated. Science literacy and science news literacy is more necessary today than ever before. Science literacy applied to news, that is, science news literacy, gives you the capacity to ask the right questions so that you can validate and accept or reject information that you are presented with. It sets you up to be able to make informed decisions in your daily life, whether it's about your home life, health, work, or important political decisions. Science literacy can and should be applied whenever you read news related to science, even if it is related to science indirectly or in only minor ways. Any scientific information should always be filtered through the lens of science literacy. Science literacy is about basic, functional familiarity with scientific perspectives, methods, theories, and facts. The scientific method is about critical and careful observation, analysis, testing, and external validation. Science literacy carries over the basic principles of the scientific method. This basic principle is critical thought, openness to counter evidence, disproof, and the acceptance of information based upon its validity rather than personal preference. Science literacy and science news literacy is necessary to determine what information is valid, what information is important, and how to use that information. Science news literacy is necessary to determine what information we are presented with in science news is legitimate and what is suspicious or invalid. Science literacy can help to determine what questions to ask and where to find the background information we need to validate news stories. Among the most important questions to ask are: who is reporting? What are their credentials? What experience do they have? What are their political, professional, or personal affiliations? What methods did they use to find their information? What methods did they use to validate their sources and information? Where did they get the data from? Did they collect it themselves? Other important questions include: are the data, methods, and findings consistent with mainstream science? Do they follow the ethics of mainstream science? How do they support or contradict previous findings? And how do they further previous research? You can also ask: what are the limitations of the data and findings? What information did they leave out? What further questions does this data and analysis bring to light? As well as, what is the significance of this data and these findings? Why is it important? What aspects of life or society does it impact? And how big is the impact? Science news literacy gives you the skill set and basic foundation of information and skills to know where to look within and outside of the news story to find answers to those questions that help you determine the legitimacy of the source and the story. To reiterate, information is only valid when it can be validated. Really, the information you need to validate the story, its data, methods, and findings or interpretations of the data should be made available within the text or footnotes of the news story, though this is not always the case. If it is not readily available within the news story, you should be able to trace the sources. If you are not able to see or find this information, this should be a red flag. A signal for validity is whether or not the information or methods have been tested in other studies, and of course, whether those other studies found this data valid. You should also cross-reference the interpretations of the meaning and impact of this information among other valid sources, ideally professional scientists or organizations or academic organizations. Thank you for joining us for the second part of this presentation on science news literacy and information, where we focused on how to use science literacy skills when you read, watch, or hear about science in the news. Please join us for the third and final part of the presentation, where we discuss how to apply your science news literacy to avoid consuming or spreading misinformation.